If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Coming up on Booked on Rock, going back to the decade of the Walkman, the boombox, MTV. That's right, the essential rock albums of the 1980s. That's next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Hey guys, welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Gary Graff is back on the podcast. He is the editor of the brand new book, The 501 Essential Albums of the 80s. Gary, welcome back to the podcast.
Always a pleasure. One of my favorites. So
yes,
nice
thanks, man. Thanks so much. So much happened in music during the 80s. MTV, Walkman, boomboxes. You say it could be the most impactful decade in music history. From a music journalist perspective, what do you remember most about that decade?
I just remember the totality of music, how it was integrated into every fiber of the culture. You know, you had music with your TV, starting with MTV, but that filtered into the rest of TV. You had music with your movies. You had music 24/7. You mentioned Walkman. I remember seeing my first Walkman the summer of 1979 when I was interning for a concert promoter in Pittsburgh, and they played us a Journey concert spot on a cassette in this Walkman. Within 2 years they had taken over, and then they became the boom boxes and everything else. So music was with us 24/7 everywhere we went, and like I say, every fiber of the society. So I just remember feeling like music was part of and was enveloping everything.
As you did with the previous book on the 90s, 501 Essential Albums of the 90s, you bring in a staff of writers to contribute to this. So talk about that. How's it laid out? How did you go about picking these albums?
Like with the 90s, the great joy of doing this book was to work with friends and colleagues and have these, I'll call them euphemistically, discussions about what should and shouldn't be in the book. The first step was, once I assembled the crew, was we establish a spreadsheet, you fire a bunch of choices, back and forth, and then you have the long list, which was about 2,500 or so albums to consider, and then you have discussions of what the 501 are going to be from that. Much like the 90s book, one of the fun things about those euphemistic discussions was, because a number of us are from here in Detroit, we would be, in our regular course of our day jobs as journalists, covering the same concert. And before the music or in between acts, we'd be having those discussions about what should be in the book and about the list. And the discussions were passionate enough that some of the people seated around us would motion to security. Like, maybe these people are going to swing at each other. We weren't really, but it got loud.
Yeah.
So, sure. There was a lot of great give and take, which, if you're a music geek, those are the discussions you live for, is to just go to the mat on what were the best albums.
I should know we're going to be talking about the rock and roll albums of the 80s, but this covers all. This is pop, country. I mean, obviously hip hop was starting to become a huge thing by the late 80s.
Yeah, we have gospel, electronic music really began its ascent.
Kraftwerk's in there, aren't they?
As well, Kraftwerk's in here, but so are a lot of the Detroit techno guys who were putting out their first albums. One of my contributors, a guy named Mike Himes, was a record store owner, and he was one of the first in on that scene, and he had a number of DJs who worked for him in the stores, and so he was ground zero around here for the Detroit techno scene. Yeah. So to have somebody like him be able to weigh in, I knew we were in good hands there with both what we were choosing and then how they were being written about.
The very first album, AC/DC's Back in Black.
I
And
was
what a way
glad
to
they did
start.
that. I mean,
Yeah.
alphabetically it works, but you never know with the design staff. What's the first album in the book going to be? But could there be, because we're chronological, could there be any other?
Right. I mean, this is not just an essential when it comes to 80s albums. This is a must have for every rock and roll fan. I would call it the biggest comeback album in rock history. What are your thoughts? Because you do have 5150 in there by Van Halen, which is a pretty big comeback album.
It's interesting. Comebacks, that's a great term and a term well worth discussing because AC/DC came back from the death of Bon Scott, but and Van Halen, of course, came back from the departure of David Lee Roth. But were those really comebacks? Both groups were on the ascent
Right.
at the time. That
Yeah.
ascent did allow a new singer to come into the band and be successful, but I don't know if that's a comeback yet.
Probably,
I
yeah,
felt like it's a
reword it.
continuation. Yeah, it's a
Like,
continuation.
the most surprising
Yeah.
continuation. Maybe we
Yeah, I
should
mean,
put it that way.
you would think you lose, but it's interesting. Two different situations here. Bon Scott became an icon by dying, whereas David Lee Roth was an icon, while he was alive and when he departed Van Halen. So I think the bands were in slightly different, different situations at the time. AC/DC, they'd had Highway to Hell. They were still in their ascent, and you had the right material and the right new singer. Whereas Van Halen had hit a peak, but then you bring in this very established singer in Sammy Hagar and allowed them to go to a new, at least commercial peak. We can argue about artistic peak or not, but certainly they were more popular with 5150, even more popular with 5150.
Maybe more fitting with the comeback label would be Ozzy's debut solo album, Blizzard of
Yeah.
Oz, which makes the list. And then it's interesting because his former band Black Sabbath is in here too with an essential album pick, 1980's Heaven and Hell with Ronnie James Dio. I was just listening to that this afternoon. Lady Evil, I love. Such a great tune.
Nice.
But the odds were up against both Sabbath and Ozzy. Both had success. Which was the bigger surprise for you?
Probably Black Sabbath. And this is this is the antithesis of what we were just talking about with AC/DC and Van Halen. Black Sabbath was on the downhill. They had really damaged their brand, with inferior albums and, performances that were inconsistent, shall we say. And so, it was almost like somebody's finished here. When Ozzy, of course, had the image. Sabbath, for those who know, they had the songwriting. They had Tony Iommi, which you never discount that guy. But there was definitely a downhill trend going on there. And then they both pop out with these really good and successful albums, and it's kind of like, there really was talent there, independent maybe of each other.
Also interesting too that Ozzy's sound as a solo artist drastically different from Sabbath. Sabbath sound with Ronnie James Dio pretty drastically different than what we heard before. I mean, you're still getting the same guitar tone and crunch from Iommi, but still the grooves, the lyrics. Obviously, Ronnie James Dio's voice is so different.
And I think that's why they were successful in both cases Sabbath's case, you bring in a guy like Dio, also a writer. So you were able to forge a sound that had one foot in the familiar, one foot in the new. Ozzy finding Randy Rhoads, who became an architect for this very modern sound, modern 1980s version, modern sound for Ozzy. And I think if they had both kind of come out sounding like they were trying to sound like Sabbath, it wouldn't have worked. But they both embraced the idea of let's try something new. And it really worked out for both of them, for Ozzy longer than for Sabbath, of course.
Moving on to 1981, this chapter leads with the Stones' Tattoo You, one of probably in my top 3 on favorite Stones albums list, arguably the last great Stones album. And I remember thinking it was an album of all originals. It's not until you get into the internet era and then you start to read articles and you find out it's songs that date as far back as mid-70s, I think, right?
Yeah.
Stitched
Earlier
together.
even. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty impressive. Where do you rank it among Stones' greatest albums?
I think it's certainly a top 10 Stones album. I think without a doubt. And it shows you how much talent was there, and we've learned this now with the anniversary reissues of Sticky Fingers and Some Girls and Let It Bleed and Exile on Main Street, hearing these other leftover tracks that are still of a very high quality. So, what we saw with Tattoo You was, I guess, a tip of the iceberg of what was
Yeah.
in the Rolling Stones vaults. And then, they went back in, of course, and did do some things to them. And then, of course, we get the Tattoo You box set, and we hear what else was
Yeah,
around
that was
and
so cool to
considered.
finally hear Start Me Up, the reggae version, because I read
Yeah,
about
right.
that for the longest time. And it's not that bad. I mean, it's really, it would have worked, I think, but not as well as the version that we know.
No, there were a lot of interesting different takes on it. We've been lucky enough to get a real glimpse over the past. I guess it's been a decade now since the expanded sets have started to come out, but into the working nature of the Rolling Stones and the trial and error, and how at least back in the day those guys would just get in the studio for hours and days and weeks, and however long Keith could stay awake.
Yeah, yes,
And
exactly.
and just create really good stuff and then make you wonder, okay, so how did you figure out this was the one you were going to put out when you had all these other things? So yeah, that's definitely for me, that's one of the top 10, maybe top 8 or 7 even, of Stones. So consistent, which given the hodgepodge that it was, pretty amazing.
You write the entry on Rush's Moving Pictures from '81. Their biggest selling album went 5 times platinum. What made this album so special?
Interesting. And Rush was among the bands that it was tough to pick what from the 80s was going to be included. And we wound up only going with Moving Pictures because, again, essential to the decade. Yeah, that was the paramount thing. I mean, there were a lot of other good Rush records during the 80s, but not necessarily essential to Rush's catalog, much less to the decade. But Moving Pictures, I think, was an album where everything Rush Phase 2 was trying to do, what they started with Farewell to Kings, I think really coalesced
Mm,
on Moving Pictures. There was both the great sonics and musicianship that are the hallmarks of Rush, but a kind of songcraft that came in that didn't take them as far as they'd get with something like New World Man later, but you still, like Tom Sawyer's perfect example, or Limelight. These were great songs as well as great tracks,
yeah, and they
and
worked
that
well on the radio, on FM rock radio.
yeah, and I really felt like this was where everything kind of fell together that Rush was trying to do in what I consider Rush Phase 2. It's nice they divide them by the live albums usually,
Yeah.
so you can see what the band's thinking.
I'm fascinated by the story of Men at Work. I don't know if there's been a book written about this band, but here's a band that they won Best New Artist at the Grammys, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah, at the Grammys. And Business as Usual, which has Who Can It Be Now, Down Under, Be Good Johnny. You write the entry on this one too. #1 on Billboard, 6 times platinum, the Grammy, Best New Artist, and you quote singer Colin Hay from the Grammys. He said, quote, "We are the men and we'll see you again." And you write, "They did, albeit for only 2 more albums." What led to the quick decline? Because they had the potential of being huge. The rest of the decade, maybe beyond.
Crazy Australians, I think.
Yeah.
And I've had the chance to talk to Colin Hay about it and Ron Stryker, the guitar player, and yeah, crazy Australians. But much you could say like any other band that breaks up, crazy Americans, crazy Brits, crazy Germans, crazy Canadians. They just, they had been a band for a while before the success, playing the pubs, coming out of the pub scene, much like In Excess was, and they just didn't have it to hold it together. Clearly, Colin was the man, but the rest of the band had some issues with that and just wasn't able to kind of let it be and keep walking down the road that made you successful.
Man, that happens, right? But I think
It
by the
does,
mid
yeah.
80s, Snakes and Ladders was an album because I remember getting their best of. It was a cassette in the bargain bin. I said, well, let me listen to it. And there's some really good stuff post. Well, there are 2 big albums, right? Cargo came, I think.
Cargo is the second one, which in some ways I like better.
Yeah.
but we still felt that the first album was the essential one. But there was something that Cargo I thought was a great follow-up. They had already had a lot of that album written when the first album was a huge success
Okay.
because nobody expected the first album to do what it did. So they were like, okay, and it started slow. So they felt like, okay, let's get to work on the next thing.
He's done well for himself now, Colin Hay. He's got
Yeah,
a solid solo career, and then I think Men at Work is done, but he is part of
he
the package '80s tours. I see
he
him every now and
leads
then.
he leads a Men at Work. He has the name.
Oh, okay.
So he leads Men at Work, a band that's called Men at Work, which is essentially his solo band. And I think it just depends on circumstances and if, where he's playing and what promoters want to do with the name. I think on the Yacht Rock tour, it's Colin Hay of Men at Work or
Okay.
something like that.
I remember hearing a great reworking acoustic version of Who Can It Be Now, which has been used in television shows and really good.
And what's the other one? It's a Cargo track. There's like a version he did with a choir in New York.
Really.
Kind of a hip bohemian choir.
The hits off that one were, Dr. Heckle and Mr. Jive, Overkill, It's a
Overkill,
Mistake.
sorry, not under, Overkill.
Okay.
And there's
Overkill.
a beautiful version of it. Like I say, it's some hipster choir, I think from Brooklyn, and it's just great.
You're right, though. That is a good album.
Oh
It's got
yeah,
High Wire on there, too, which is another great one.
yeah, that's a wonderful song. So a two-hit wonder.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Difficult to see. Always in motion is the future.
In 1982, there was an album called Thriller, I think. Is that what it was called?
I've heard of it. I've heard of it. It was some guy. He was on Motown, right?
Right?
He was some oldie from Motown.
Yeah, that's the year pop and rock merge because of Thriller. Paul McCartney's on that album, The Girl Is Mine, but Eddie Van Halen, my
Right.
man, plays the solo on Beat It. For free, didn't take any payment on that. That's the story that Alex always, what are you doing? His brother Alex. But talk about how important that album is in terms of pop culture, in terms of race, rock and pop coming together. Has there been anything like it since?
I mean, Prince, was
Yeah.
in the immediate wake of that. But no, hugely, hugely important for so many reasons. Where it took Michael Jackson's artistry and what we saw was possible on a pop album. Beat It, such a great case in point. But this was a pop album that had significant balls. Even the lighter track had an emotional weight and resonance that you associated with rock albums, whether it was Joni Mitchell or Van Halen. There was just such a depth in the writing, which, was Quincy Jones was the one who encouraged Michael Jackson to write more this time than he had on Off the Wall. And then the sonics of it were so great. It was such a great headphone album, which, in the Walkman era when we're all sticking stuff in our ears, to be able to hear all that sonic detail, just a tremendous piece of musical work. And then on the business side, to have Beat It be the video that broke down the color wall on MTV in a big way.
Big time.
It's sometimes overstated because there were some black artists on MTV, but they had initially said no to this because Michael Jackson was considered too pop. And it took Walter Yetnikoff and Columbia Records to go to the mat with MTV, threaten not to to pull all their videos and not give them any more, and for them to finally take a shot at it. And lo and behold, the audience loved it. The rock audience really did love Michael Jackson, even if they'd end up making fun of him later on. But that's because it became so ubiquitous. The only thing we've had in our recent history with that level sensation is Taylor Swift.
Yeah, Taylor Swift. I was going to say Britney Spears, but Taylor Swift.
Yeah, and the music, but even in Taylor Swift's case, the music didn't make the same type of impact. The Taylor Swift package did, and certainly live. But, wow, I mean, and it just kept going and going. I remember getting into 1984 and thinking, this is still the biggest album in the world.
I'm now at that age now where I got more people younger than me than ever before. So I have these generations of music fans that just have no idea how popular that album and Michael Jackson was. Like, you can't even describe, because he was everywhere right up through the rest of the decade. But that album, and at that time, Michael had a perfect image. You know, there was no controversies, no headlines that were painting him in negative light. So he was just, he could do no wrong.
He didn't show as crazy.
He didn't show as crazy.
No, we didn't get the hyperbaric chamber or the Elephant Man's bones
Right.
until the other side of the Victory Tour.
Yeah,
And then
exactly.
but Bubbles was there for the Victory Tour.
Bubbles.
So
yeah.
we really no, I mean, people were just blown away by the artistry.
1983, Huey Lewis and the News, Sports, Heart and Soul, I Want a New Drug, Heart of Rock and Roll, and If This Is It. Again, you got the entry on this one. I'm picking all the ones you write the entries on.
I get it, yeah.
This was a band on the ropes, right? This is a story of, we got to have a hit, otherwise we're going to have to drop you. And they come up with this album that is, to me, it's one of my favorite. And I love Huey Lewis and the News. They always kind of took a little hit for being a little too poppy. But to me, I love this album. I love this band. So I guess that was my question. Were they not taken seriously enough?
No, I think they were. I mean, they certainly established their cred on the road. What preceded Sports, while they were holding on to Sports to make sure they had the right commitment from their record company, they were out on the road on the Working on the Living tour, literally doing that, because that was their only income, kind of analogous to what Bruce Springsteen had to do before Darkness on the Edge of Town in the 70s. But no, I think Huey Lewis and the News always had cred with the rock audience. People knew and understood they were a live band, and they were like a bar club band. So there was an affection for them, and they were fortunate enough that they had made some videos so that even during the wait to Sports, you could still see Working for a Living on MTV. And by the time they were able to put Sports out, you had people primed for it, and you had a record company ready to promote it, and a band ready to work for it. And, they really worked hard to make that. It was, like you said, it was do or die here.
Yeah,
And
Chrysalis, right? That was their label, Chrysalis.
Chrysalis was their label. And, they knew this was their potentially last shot. And they really went to work on it.
And they were everywhere, pretty close to Michael Jackson.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody could match MJ, but when they were on Back to the Future soundtrack, I mean,
Right.
They were huge for a while. They had a great run, and I really enjoyed what they did into the 90s. They had the Mutt Lange produced album, Hard at Play, I think it's
Right. And they had the Soul album, the Soul Covers album.
Yep.
No, it's kind of tragic what happened there with Huey and his hearing issues, because they were far from done.
I know.
And
Meniere's, they call it Meniere's disease.
Meniere's disease, yeah.
So if he tries to sing, he can't hear the notes
he
he's
can't
singing.
hear. No, he has the same issue with speaking too.
Yeah.
It's very sad,
but he's got a Broadway thing that's going to be happening.
It already did. It already came and went.
Oh, okay.
It was reviewed well, and it'll go on tour. I mean, that's almost the kind of production that's made to be on, to come to the provinces even more than to be on the Great White Way.
Talking about Mutt Lange, Def Leppard's 1983 album Pyromania. Michael Gallucci writes the entry on this one. He writes, quote, "Nothing on Def Leppard's first two albums pointed to its future as one of the biggest rock bands in the world in just a few short years. But the arrival of album 3 during the first month of 1983 changed that." So Mutt Lange, the big difference maker here? How important is
he had worked with them on High and Dry already.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, Mutt Lange was also behind Back in Black. Yep. with AC/DC. He knows how to produce a rock record, a big commercial rock record. He took them in with the intent of making every song a hit single. And that's what you got, everything under the microscope. Def Leppard itself was peaking. They had 2 albums under their belt. They had a new guitarist and co-writer in Phil Collen, who had worked with them on High and Dry and was now a full-time member. And he and Steve Clark really gelled, as guitarists, and Phil Collen as part of the writing team. So all the ingredients were there.
And he pushed them hard. Joe Elliott tells a story. He sang he was singing so hard that the blood was, he didn't have any blood circulation in his
Yeah.
head, and he had to stand upside down and get the blood going back into his head.
And
Yeah,
these
he
were
pushed him hard.
these were the days before Pro Tools, and
Right.
so the guitar players had to play every overdub part. You just couldn't cut and paste and stack.
And this also set the template for rock the rest of the decade. I mean, this was one of the go-to sounds.
That was the Boston's first album of the 80s. If you remember, when the first Boston album came out, everybody wanted their rock and roll records to sound like that. And, I think Mutt Lange was influenced by that sound that Tom Scholz had. Conversely, the rest of the rock world wanted to get the Pyromania sound, the hard rock world at
Yeah.
least. And we certainly saw that quickly with Bon Jovi, with Motley Crue, and Scorpions. Everybody was looking at that as sort of a template for at least the sonic impact they wanted to have, even if it didn't hit all the same sonic bases.
Yeah, and Phil Collin talked about going back to Thriller again. Thriller had, I believe, it was 7 singles. I think it was,
Yeah.
and that was the goal of Hysteria. When they came out with Hysteria in 1987, we want 7 singles. We want to do what Michael Jackson did.
Yep.
And they did it. Yeah.
They did. It took him a minute with Hysteria, though. That
Yeah.
people forget that came out of the box slow.
Right.
And
Right.
there was real concern about whether that album was going to be so successful. You're sitting at triple platinum and worried about whether you're successful. Once upon a time, they would have been deliriously happy.
I have a note here. First 2 singles, Animal and Women.
Right. And just didn't connect in the same way as Photograph did in the other Pyromania songs, but got around to Pour Some Sugar on Me and everything was all right.
Yeah, it got played at a strip bar in Florida.
Yep.
And the local radio station started playing it.
Yeah.
And now that the album's coming back, Armageddon It, Love Bites, Rocket. I'm a big Hysteria guy. I love Pyromania, but I always have to go with Hysteria. You got to choose.
It's like the first
between them.
girl. It's like the first girlfriend.
Right? Yeah. What about you?
There's a part of me that goes with On Through the Night.
Oh yeah.
But
yeah.
but there's a there's a personal thing there too. The same concert promoter I mentioned earlier that I was working for during that summer, we had the Judas Priest, Scorpions, Def Leppard tour in a theater that the promoter owned. And I spent a lovely afternoon with, pretty sure it was Joe and Rick and maybe Sav, just hanging out in my little office.
How cool.
Where I was working from. So, that was On Through the Night. So there's a sentimental attachment there. But, I would, if it was between Hysteria and Pyromania, I'd probably go with Pyromania for me. A little more raw, not quite as going for the hits as Hysteria was, juggling the two.
And Jim Steinman almost produced Hysteria.
I know.
In the beginning, he was the guy that was.
They were, yeah. I'm not surprised that didn't work out.
Right.
I mean, it barely worked out with Meatloaf. I think a lot of that was just, he's not a band guy, whereas Mutt knew how to work with a band.
One of the era's biggest bands came to an end in 1983, and that was the Police. What a way to end, though. Synchronicity. Sting, if he stuck around, what would the rest of the 80s been like for the Police?
That is a great question.
Because they did try reuniting, and they just couldn't get along.
Right, yeah. And, they eventually reunited to tour again.
The tour.
And understood, we're bad together when we're in the studio together. Although I will say it would be interesting because I've spoken with all 3 of the guys over the years, and they've all grown up more and come to appreciate each other more. It would be interesting to see what they could do together now that they've chilled out a little bit. It's hard to say where they would have taken it. Would it have been that Dream of the Blue Turtle sound that Sting kind of went on, that more, the jazzier, slightly jazzier, definitely thicker in terms of sound type of direction, or would they have stripped it back down from Synchronicity and gone punky again? It's really hard and maybe impossible to say.
Yeah.
It's intriguing.
You're the author of the 2005 book, The Ties That Bind, Bruce Springsteen, A to E to Z. Born in the USA from 1984 is in this book. His biggest seller. Is it his best? Is it better than Born to Run?
I don't think so. I don't think it's better than The River. really, but it's a great album. The pump was primed for Bruce Springsteen in 1984. He'd come off of Hungry Heart, his first big hit single, The River being such a great album. He had won a great degree of artistic credibility with Nebraska, stepping back from what would have been the logical next move and putting out this stripped down, rustic, acoustic album, or not all acoustic, but this crazy raw album. Then came with the big hit album, then went for broke. But I think he made people wait a little longer for that album, but he won a lot of respect too by putting Nebraska out before it. And so, and and the market was just ready for him. People loved him obviously as a live act. And there were a bunch of people who had not yet seen him. So they were ready to have an album and then a tour to come with it, and basically to jump on the Bruce train.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Right, that's it. I'm going to be right outside those doors. The next time I have to come in here, I'm cracking skulls.
We got to talk about Phil Collins, because by 1985, he was the definition of ubiquitous. He was everywhere, and his album No Jacket Required, huge. He's writing for movie soundtracks. He was in movies, and
he was producing albums.
He was producing. You could hear his drums.
Duetting with people.
Philip Bailey, right? Yeah. And then you'd hear a hit single on the radio, and it'd be by a different artist. You're like, those drums sound familiar. It's like, yeah, he's on that one. And then he had Genesis a year later, Invisible Touch. In 1980s, as we talked about MTV and Walkman, and maybe was that the decade of overexposure? I mean, was he overexposed? Because by the 90s, then all of a sudden, it's like it just turned against him.
Yeah, he was without a doubt. He was.
I love Phil Collins,
but right. The key here is it was all honest. He wasn't trying to be, the constant in your life. He was just out there doing his music, getting over another divorce. And it seems like whenever he goes through those hard personal times, he becomes very prolific and very, very creative. And so he was just taking the job. He was being a working musician. He was doing his own work. He was playing with his band. He was taking the jobs that came to him. And like I said, this wasn't part of some Machiavellian plot. He was just being that guy who wanted to make as much music as he could, and he made a lot of really great music. Howard Jones, he was
right.
He was all over the place, but I cut him slack because he was honestly all over the place. Do you tell a guy, don't produce this album that you really dig because you're overexposed? Is that a reason not to create?
Yeah, so, I mean, why would he say no to those offers?
Don't do a Genesis album because your last solo album was so good. It's counterintuitive, and the market in the 80s was big enough to handle him.
To me, and it was admirable because those are his buddies, Genesis. Those were his guys. He's not going to ditch them.
No, he's
make an album with them.
He loved being in a band still.
I wonder now, because he's in pretty rough shape physically, that how much that played a role in it, because he really probably took its toll. I mean,
overworked. Yeah, I think, yes, probably. But he went on for another couple decades still.
Sure.
And he's a case of wear and tear. And somehow Keith Richards manages to wear the wear and tear better.
He's still going.
Than everybody else. But
Keith.
But no, Phil worked hard.
80s, Bon Jovi is another huge band during that decade. Slippery When Wet, 1986. Also, Peter Gabriel's So came out that year. But I want to talk about Metallica's Master of Puppets, released early March 1986. Talk about how influential this album is. Rob St. Mary writes in his entry about how its influence is heard to this very day.
Oh, absolutely. And not just in metal, but you do hear it in hip hop, and you hear cadences, you hear rhythmic approaches in EDM. Even in some aspects of pop, they go for a sonic impact, not unlike what Metallica introduced really with Kill 'Em All, but certainly, Master of Puppets was the refinement of it, and the first I'm trying, it was almost like Genesis. They did back in the 70s. They did Trespass, good album, interesting, definitely a foundational album. But then you get the like Nursery Crime and Foxtrot, and now you're telling the story. Same thing with Metallica. You had Kill 'Em All, but then you get to Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning, and we're talking about this is the story here. This is the sound. And from here we're going to refine it and tighten it and really perfect it till we get in the 90s and we're ready to mess with it.
My first exposure was Ride the Lightning. My older brother had the cassette. So that's my personal favorite.
That's the way to hear it too, is on cassette.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. On that Walkman, that GPX Walkman.
No, but,
yeah.
But it's amazing, how I think back to how foreign Metallica and all the thrash bands sounded, even though they really should have.
Oh, at that time.
If you were like a fan of Deep Purple or Black Sabbath, you should have at least and I think the fans, of course, did understand where, what this was and where it came from. But it still felt very foreign and very new. And I think it frightened some people too.
Yeah. Well, at that time when the video for One came out, we're talking hairband era. We're talking Winger, Warrant, Slaughter. And here's this video that is so huge. It's so hugely popular that just speaks volumes for just how good that song was. And Guns N' Roses similar with Appetite for Destruction. It's like that connection, that kind of, here we are in that glam hairband era. And here's this band. It's just dirty, raw. It's like I always call them like the Stones on steroids. And it almost bridged the gap to what we would hear in the 90s with grunge.
Some of it, I think, with Appetite for Destruction, you really had a very commercial. That's not a metal album.
Right.
To me, that's a hard rock album. That's the next evolution of, I guess, the Aerosmith generation. But it had enough of the glam, the hair band, because they were from LA. And there's a good juxtaposition. Guns N' Roses is definitely an LA band.
Mm-hmm.
Metallica from another planet, but they came from San Francisco, where the underground there was a little darker and a little bit dirtier and a little more raw. Guns N' Roses came from a place that was slicker and flashier and glossier, and they understood how to throw just enough dirt on it to make it a little dangerous.
Yet that took a while to take off. Why do you think it took a while? Because I think it came out in 87, but it wasn't until 88.
Right, because it was a little foreign sounding too. Right. It wasn't as easy a sell as Rat or Dock In. These were not hard rock songs with pop hooks, or rather pop songs with hard rock sonics. This was hard rock that in some cases had hooks.
Yeah. And didn't Slash audition for Poison?
At one point.
Right. That just boggles the mind,
It's such a small, if you ever read Tom Beaujour.
Tom Beaujour, yeah.
Fine Stocks, even if you read, They're Nothing But a Good Time, how small and insular that community was.
Yeah, so not much of a surprise.
It was hard not to audition for some of those bands.
Yeah.
If you were at all part of the scene.
1987 was the year of Joshua Tree, U2. What an album. That's my favorite U2 album.
Is it?
Yeah, I still Achtung Baby's a close second.
I'm Achtung Baby 1, Unforgettable Fire 2, and then we can talk about the rest. But yeah, no, that was a breakthrough album for U2. It really, well, it was another one where the pump was primed, much like it was for Springsteen with Born in the USA. U2 had made this gradual ascent, and by the time they got done, they were at an arena level with the Unforgettable Fire, and were able to take that next leap to the Joshua Tree, where the whole world from Time magazine on was ready for them.
I miss those days of gradual ascents. We don't have that anymore.
We kind of do, but you can't ascend to a place as big as you used to be able to.
True. And record labels, you don't have the record label fostering a young band and giving them some time.
Yeah, I mean, there still are some rock bands who are, I don't think they're necessarily being allowed that time. It's just that, you hit this plateau that's so much lower than what it was in what we're talking about, the 80s here. And everybody's kind of okay with that, and they're not necessarily working to get it to the next level.
Yeah.
I think especially in the rock world, we really have surrendered and capitulated to the idea that it can only get so big anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can't
And
grab as many people's attention at once like we once were able to because everything's splintered off into different options.
yeah, exactly. And the audience is bigger, but it's not nearly as loyal.
Right.
And like you say, it is splintered in different directions. So it's hard to get the same type of traction and the same type of ascension. I mean, even you look at a band like Arcade Fire now, I mean, they're going to do well, but they're not going to turn into Pyromania or the Joshua
Right.
Tree. That ship sailed, even though they've had the kind of ascent we're talking about within their world. It's just not, there isn't that level to ascend all the way up to.
On to 1988 and an album that was so ahead of its time. We talked about this on your last appearance for the book on the 90s. Jane's Addiction, Nothing Shocking, comes out in 1988. You're talking about an album so ahead of its time. With bands like GNR and Def Leppard and Poison ruling the charts, this album would have trouble finding a place. But how important is this album in terms of what was to come in the 90s?
Well, extremely important. I mean, this was nothing shocking. Everything's shocking about that album. We didn't know how to classify it. So what is this weird mix of rhythms and the guitar approach and attack and Perry's vocals and what he's singing about and what the hell is he singing about? It was arty, but it was also hard.
Yeah, it was like metal. It
And
was
yeah,
almost,
there was metal in there was punk in there was funk in there was jazz in there. It
yes.
was it was this real kind of alchemy that would become so much a part of what we heard in a lot of the 90s. There was grunge. There were elements of what we would come to call grunge, which was developing at the same time that Jane's Addiction was. It's another one where you compare, like, let's compare Soundgarden and Jane's Addiction. Okay, one's clearly an LA product, one is clearly the Pacific Northwest. But yeah, we nobody knew what to make of it other than this is really cool. And
Yeah.
this is really different. And it was polar. I remember it being so polarizing at the time. You either liked it or you didn't. And a lot of
Yeah.
people didn't because it wasn't straightforward. And we had, as you said, we had GNR, and we had Metallica, and we had the hair bands. And for some people, yeah, we had the Soundgarden. Even Nirvana was around by that time. But you had these more straightforward rock bands with more discernible and more familiar kind of rock flavors. And then you
Yeah.
had these four oddballs. And what do you make of them?
Jane Says is on there too, the
Yep.
acoustic.
Yeah, nice, cool. And so how did we jump from one to the next? But
Yeah.
that was its appeal. It
Another one
really
you
was.
have from 88 is Living Colors Vivid, which is
Oh yeah.
fabulous. Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Pull out your pants pockets. All kids of the future wear their pants inside out.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, plus a video highlight and a link to our YouTube channel. Links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Moving on to the final year of the decade, released in 1989, Aerosmith's Pump. And we talked about big comeback albums. Permanent Vacation is really the comeback, but
Right. We have it in there because I just thought it took Permanent Vacation to the next level. To me, it was just like, okay, yeah, this is the songwriting's fully back now. You have the little bits of the unsteadiness that was part of Permanent Vacation, solid on Pop. Everything just locked in.
and
And
for people who may not understand or remember, Aerosmith at the start of the decade and Aerosmith at the end of the decade, two very different stories. They were
yeah.
done.
Oh, well,
Right?
we
I mean,
had,
they were,
we had, what was it, Rockin' a Hard Place? Was it
yeah,
two guitar players? I mean, what an abysmal record from a great band. And Done with Mirrors was okay. There were moments there, but yeah, it really was first Permanent Vacation and then Pump that was okay, we're back.
And I believe the Run DMC Walk This Way
Right, that was in the middle of
hit
that.
that's what sparked it,
Yeah.
and then Permanent Vacation. But yeah, Joe Perry was out, and they had the guitars from also I think from the Boston area.
Rick, what's his name? There were two of them because Brad dropped out as well. But those guys
Right.
those guys were boss. And it's funny when you mention the idea of this Run DMC, the Aerosmith, that great collaboration on Walk This Way. That says so much about what the '80s were. The rock audience and MTV, really was the catalyst for this. Rock fans were willing to listen to hip hop songs and vice versa because you had this very democratic kind of institution in MTV. The '80s was a decade where you had music fans more than any other, just music fans. If it was going to be Public Enemy and then the next thing you played was Bon Jovi, that was happening in the '80s. Not everybody, of course, and certainly you still had some barriers, but you had people who were just music fans, and that's really what set the '80s apart from all the other decades.
It's what I remember about MTV, coming home from school, watching it and seeing how they would lay it out. It would be just as you said, rock and roll, and then all this, you'd see Aerosmith maybe, and then Public Enemy.
Yeah.
And then Jody Watley, and then Prince, and then Michael Jackson. It would be just
cameo. I mean, it was just it's just everything that went by you. And so, as I said, I think that really made for many millions who would just call themselves music fans.
Jimmy Crespo, by the way, that was the guy.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, Jimmy Crespo. He was there for a short period. A few more to wind down here. I got to mention The Cure because it's one of my favorite bands, and they made this book more than a few times, but in 1989 they released Disintegration, which is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Were you a fan of The Cure in the 80s, and what are your thoughts on this album?
I thought some of the mope was a little overdone.
That's why I ask.
I mean, it's just okay. It's a shtick. It works for you. If you're that miserable of a person, God love you, and God.
We had that group of kids in high school that were the goth kids,
So
Edward Scissorhands look.
Yep, Robert Smith and Morrissey. I'm sorry you guys are so unhappy, but
they hated each other.
At least you know how to write a tune.
Yeah.
And Disintegration was, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me is in here too, where I think that was really the commercial takeoff for them. But Disintegration was so conceptually and thematically locked in. That is an album with a capital A. Please listen to me from front to back. You're going to love some of these songs more than others, but you are just going to love. And, it's in the CD era, so there was more of it to love.
Yeah, and those big, grand thematic openings.
The long tracks.
The long tracks. And on their most recent album, I think it's even extended further because there's songs where it's literally the first half of the song is instrumental, and then you hear Robert kick in with the vocals.
Yeah. And, that's what The Cure does. And they do it arguably better. They certainly do it as well as the prog bands with their own particular flavor. But yeah, in Disintegration, that to me is the Cure album. That's like, here's everything this band is about. Because there are tunes on there, and there are hooks, and there are melodies. But within this great thematic piece that is everything about the miserable bastard he was at the time.
Yeah, he was singing about getting old on Head on the Door in 1985, and he would have been
26 or something at the time.
He would have been about 25, 26.
Yeah.
I'm getting old. Are you really?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Well, those were the rock and roll, I mean, that's when 30 seemed like
yeah.
We didn't know we were going to have 80-year-old rock stars.
Right. Didn't they said the Stones were old when they were doing Miss You.
Well, oh, yeah.
Some girls
in their 30s. When the Stones turned 30, there was a lot of I remember reading at the time, being younger and a fan, and can these old guys still rock and roll? And now we look back on it and like, really?
Yeah.
You didn't have that perspective.
Hey, what do you think of Hackney Diamonds by the Stones?
I thought it was a fine album. Everything about it was really good. I did not expect it to become a Sticky Fingers or even a Tattoo You, or a Some Girls or any. I didn't expect it to have the impact of a classic because you can't do that anymore.
No.
It just the marketplace doesn't allow for it. But solid album.
Yeah, above your expectations, because that's what it was for me. I didn't expect it to be
One
as
thing
good.
I've learned with the Stones is to never count them out. When they mean business, they can still do it. And they've shown that throughout their careers. You can go from Black and Blue to Some Girls.
How do you feel the decade ended? Because we have also in that year Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood, Skid Row, their self-titled debut was out in '89, but we also had Full Moon Fever from Petty. So rock and roll was still rocking the charts by the end of the decade. How did you feel about it?
And would into the 90s.
Yeah.
We would, I thought there were, there were a lot of good albums. Bob Dylan had one of his best albums with Oh Mercy. He had a great many really good rock albums, even on the underside, like Bob Mould going solo with Workbook, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers really coming into their own.
Yeah, I didn't mention them. Yeah.
That was the year Soundgarden had Louder Than Love, and then you had the Stone Roses, which was the harbinger of Britpop, the Britpop of the 90s. So there was a lot of great stuff to end the decade on. And then we had the, off the rock tip, but you had the country class of '89, Garth Brooks and Clint Black and Alan Jackson and those guys who basically created a whole new era of country music. And let's not forget 9 Inch Nails had Pretty Hate Machine that year.
And then there was this band called Nirvana that nobody knew about that had an album out right in 1989
I think that was before that. I think it was like 7 or 88.
Right.
Album.
Even further back. So, here was this band about to emerge and become the biggest band.
I think things were coming. I mean, like I say, you already saw it with, Alice in Chains was starting to emerge. You had Soundgarden, Mother Love Bone happening. That scene was starting to make a lot of noise.
Yeah, Soundgarden had been around since the mid 80s.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, Bleach was 1989.
Was it 89? Okay.
Yeah, and
I know we really kind of thought about that.
Really interesting
for the book, and just decided, no, not an essential part of the 80s story.
No, because it was more of an essential when you get into the 90s to go back and listen to it.
Right.
But at that time,
exactly, we felt like we felt like having Soundgarden in there, having Louder Than Love in there was a more essential representation of the 80s than Bleach was.
Booked on Rock Podcast will be back after this.
Well, we're waiting.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock Podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Was Milli Vanilli in there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and they're in there.
I thought they were.
So they're in there.
Yeah.
They're in there for a number of reasons. Forgetting Everything That Happened. A pretty good pop album. Very emblematic of what pop sounded like in the 80s. Given everything that happened, that it wasn't those two guys, it's essential because it's part of what happened in the 80s. It's also emblematic of what the pop machinery did. We had kind of forgotten and or excused the Archies and the Partridge Family and, some of those examples of quote unquote bands that weren't necessarily really singing or performing. And we kind of forgotten that. So that's why this was so shocking. The 80s felt like they had so much credibility for all the glitz and the glamour and the MTV. You felt like these acts were really performing. And Milli Vanilli was this wet slap across the face. That, oh, yeah, somebody could fake it.
And the moment it all came crashing down was right down the road from me here in Connecticut at Lake Compounds, Bristol, Connecticut. That was where the record or whatever they were playing skipped.
Yeah, tape. Right.
The tape skipped.
They used a DAT tape, I think.
DAT tape, and it skipped.
Yep.
Yeah, that was summer of 89 or 90 or whatever it was.
I think earlier, even maybe. Well, it might have been 80. It was the Club MTV tour. I remember that. And yeah, so it was really, really shocking. But we felt like that had to be in here. That was so much a part of the 80s and represented so much of the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
And, we do tend to forget that it was a pretty good pop album. It just wasn't the two guys who were on the cover or on stage.
If they had come honest with it, maybe it would have done okay.
I mean, we know now, let the ugly people sing, right?
Right. Yes, exactly.
If the tunes are good, the audience is gonna
Yes.
go with it. And by the way, when we finally saw them, they weren't that ugly.
Yeah.
Well,
on the other end of it, do you think, I mean, they ended up, Rob and, what was his name? They ended up singing, Rob and Fab, they were on Arsenio and sang the songs pretty decently. I think they could have got, I mean, if you did some work in the studio on it, they probably would have been able to get away with it.
Probably would have worked. It's a sad story. It really is a sad story all the way around. But definitely an essential album for somebody to listen to.
501 Essential Albums of the 80s. It's out now. Find it where books are sold. And look for it at your nearest bookstore, too. Go to bookedonrock.com. You can find your nearest independent bookstore. And where can people find you online, Gary?
They can find me at Graff on Music on X, Gary Graff on Music on Facebook, Real Graff on Music on Instagram, and Graff on Music on Blue Sky.
Cool. Now, you do plan one more, right? 70s?
I hope. Maybe more than one more. We have started the 70s spreadsheet. So that's fun.
Well, the 60s would be fun.
60s will be fun too. To me, those are the four crucial album decades. We could do an aughts, a 2000s. It wouldn't feel quite the same, but those other decades were such album decades. So hopefully, if people want to see those, please buy copies of the 80s and 90s books, so we can get a green light. Certainly for the 70s. I'd feel bad if we couldn't get to the 70s, because that's where the album really came into its own as the primary art form of popular music. The 60s were where it began, but the 70s was where it really became that primary art form. So I'd really like the Crack to figure out which Led Zeppelin album we're going to leave out, or thank goodness the Beatles didn't have many albums in the 70s. But the Stones did. And many bands, and we had this problem in the 80s too. So many significant acts that released significant albums every freaking year. And so how do you get your head around that and knock it down to 501? We've done it twice, so I guess we'll be able to do it again. But
yeah, and it's a super fun read, and it's a great conversation starter if you're having some friends over.
Yeah,
crack that open and start discussing. You're bound to get in a few arguments.
Yes. And that's like I said in the introduction to the 90s book. These are books that are meant to cause arguments.
Yeah.
Hopefully joyous arguments.
That's right.
Like, as I said earlier, that our inner music geek revels in.
Gary Graff, thank you again, man.
Always a pleasure. It really is. Hope we get to do another one and keep this rolling.
That's it. It's in the books.